This is the first time I've spoken, not the first time I've spoken to a college group, but the first time since I have been the parent of a college student. So it's sort of inescapable for me that you guys belong here and I don't anymore. But thank you for inviting me. I am an office specialist, so we're going to take our deepest dive into office. We'll try to touch on what's going on in the other commercial sectors really briefly. It's mostly nationally, but with a little bit of a Boston flavor as well. So by show of hands, how many of you are actually majoring in real estate or business? Okay, what about, okay, that's half of you. What about like economics? My people, all right. Liberal arts, English, poli-sci, psychology, that sort of thing. All right, what about STEM? All right, some people aren't sure, which is, you can talk to your guidance counselor afterward if you're not sure, I guess. Cool. So I was a poli-sci major back in college with an econ minor, and then I got an MBA. So I think we understand each other. So let's dig into this. We're going to talk about the overall CRE environment. I have a couple of kind of pop quiz questions for you. We will briefly cover the other commercial, what I call the other commercial sectors, and we'll go a little deeper on office. And then if we have time, hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A. So I have two really squiggly lines on this chart. Does anybody know what at least one of these lines represents? If you know one of them, just like raise your hand, shout it out, I don't care. Yes?
Occupancy, office occupancy.
That's not a terrible guess, but no. Yes?
The federal funds rate.
And which one's that?
The red one.
The red one is the federal funds rate. All right, good. What about the blue one? Yes?
Vacancy.
No.
Cap rate.
It's close. You're in the right ballpark. Yes.
Inflation.
It's kind of sort of close. That's the 10-year Treasury yield. So I show these together for two reasons. One is that this actually shows the yield curve inversion phenomenon that some of you may have heard about. So you can see back like 2000, again, right before the great financial crash in 2008, the federal funds rate moved above the 10-year Treasury yield. The federal funds rate is a short-term rate, right? Very short-term. The 10-year is a longer-term rate. When short-term rates are higher than long-term rates, most of the time that has indicated that the economy is on the brink of recession. You can see it's been inverted for quite a while now. So what is normal is what we see kind of in the mid-2010s and then the early 2000s, right, where we have short-term rates being below long-term rates. That's why banks lend money at higher rates than they give you for your deposits, right? The other thing that's important about this is when you have these spikes in interest rates. So the 10-year Treasury is a really important one for commercial real estate financing. It's pretty much unprecedented that it's gone up that much that quickly. And that has implications for the real estate industry as a whole. It has implications for values in particular. It's real estate assets are income-producing assets. They're worth more when the carrying cost is lower, right? Now, one of the things that's happened here, in conjunction with all the structural shifts that we've seen in the last decade, and especially since the pandemic, is that instead of responding uniformly to this situation, the commercial real estate asset types have responded differently. So, those interest rates. Good news is they're starting to ease, right? So this is what we call our value-weighted repeat sales index, which is just a fancy, overly technical way of saying this is how we track real estate asset values. So two of these, retail and industrial, are behaving similarly. You can see that industrial property values have really diverged. They've been the star of the bunch in the last decade. But since this interest rate spike happened, they both had a little dip in values, but then they leveled out. And they each have different superpowers. So for industrial, it's the ability to mark rents to market, which we'll talk a little more about. So if your income is the same and your discount rate goes up, then your value goes down, right? But if your income can go up, then you can maintain values, and that's what's happening in industrial. Retail superpower is a little different. It's not really rent growth, it's just occupancy. The retail market is from an occupancy perspective, the strongest performing commercial sector right now, which 2012 me would never have believed, but here we are. Now, office and multifamily have responded much more strongly to this high interest rate environment. And again, I think they have different kryptonites, right? So in the case of multifamily, again, you can see values have gone way up over the last decade for multifamily. But the crash that you see, the 30-ish% decline there since the recent peak, that is occupancy related, and it's because of supply. We'll see a little more about that in a minute, but essentially, the multifamily market nationally is oversupplied. How can that be when we also have a housing crisis at the same time? It's complicated, but it's the reality from the standpoint of a developer who would want to deliver market rate apartments to the market, right? Office has a different kryptonite, and it's demand. Office demand has changed dramatically in the last 4 years. It's still kind of shaking out. But the impact is kind of the same, that not only is there this discount rate shift affecting values of office and multifamily, but there's also changes in the fundamentals. There's changes in occupancy and hence income, and so they've been hit kind of with the double whammy. So that's kind of the setup. Now, a few what I'll call macroeconomic secular trends going on. So this is real goods spending, net of services. So this is going to drive demand for retail and industrial distribution centers and properties, right? You can see that we're at or above the long-term trend after some weirdness in the pandemic when we sat at home for a year and ordered stuff on Amazon and went to Home Depot every other weekend. I was one of those people. This is office attendance. The one on the left is transit ridership. I ride the MBTA commuter rail every day, except today when I drove because I had to be here. It's mostly full, but there are fewer trains than there were 5 years ago. So I can feel this. I can also park closer to the train, which is kind of nice for me. Boston's transit ridership is below the national average, which is itself only 3/4 of what it was in 2019. And then the office visits on the right-hand side here. This is from Placer.ai. They're a location and mobility data service provider. They're tracking our phones. That's what they're doing. They say they're doing it anonymously. You can believe them if you want to. But again, Boston is slightly behind. So there's another trend that's going on too. So this is another quiz question. This is a company's headcount. Any idea what the company is? This is a company that's been in the news in the last couple of weeks. And they actually play in all these sectors, multifamily excluded. Any ideas? All right, this is Amazon's employment trend. So they were in the news because 2 weeks ago, their CEO announced a 5-day back in the office mandate effective in January of next year. Literally in the same announcement, he said, and we need to reduce headcount. So I can put 2 and 2 together. They haven't hired anybody in the last 3 years on the net. Obviously, they have more than office using workers, but if you walk through downtown Seattle, there's a lot of buildings there that, oh, that is Amazon, oh, that's Amazon, that was Amazon, now it's in Bellevue, that was Amazon, now it's in Bellevue, that was Amazon, now it's gone, right? So there's a lot of office using workers in the Pacific Northwest who are Amazon employees, and they don't need as many of those employees. So we've got this kind of structural shift with lower attendance combined with flatlining job growth. Amazon is not alone here. Office using employment for the last 3 decades has on average risen about 2% a year. In the last year, it's been less than 0.5%, and that's during an economic expansion, which is pretty much unprecedented. And if you look at just population demographics, I know this room feels pretty full, but the reality is there are fewer young people in college getting degrees There's kind of an enrollment crisis going on. Maybe you've heard about this. There are fewer just people in general, and so there are going to be fewer credentialed and qualified people to work in what now we think of as the knowledge sector workforce going forward. So we're looking at growth rates kind of below 1% for the next decade, whereas in the past it's been 2+% during expansions. That's going to hamper the recovery of the office sector, which we'll get to. So this is, by the way, happening in unevenly across markets. So the blue dots here are 2015 to 2019 growth rates in office using employment. You can see Austin, Texas is kind of the darling to the left. Boston is just to the right of the US as a whole. The red dots are 2024 to now, basically first half of this decade. So you can see it's slowed down almost everywhere. These are the projections for the next 5 years. So Austin at 1.7 is leading the way, but that's actually below what the national average was in the late 2010s. So there will be some unevenness, but it looks like the tide is kind of ebbing out here. These are kind of at the top of all three periods. These guys, during the pandemic era, shot up, right? Lots of migration to Florida and Texas. They're going to kind of revert to the mean, which is still above the national mean, but the mean for those markets. And then you've got like San Francisco and San Jose, and Portland you could add in there if you wanted, where I'm not saying they're going to recover to be leaders of employment growth, but they are going to, it looks like, recover to something above the national average. And then here's Boston, just for reference. A lot of this is, of course, life sciences, biotech employment, which has dried up pretty considerably, but most people think will start coming back pretty soon. So, industrial. This is supply, so the net delivered square feet nationally over the past decade or so. You can see the huge ramp up there. And then this is absorption or demand. So remember, again, when I was sitting at home buying stuff off Amazon, there's all this demand, the yellow, in 2021, and then the supply is like, oh my gosh, we got to catch up. And now, I don't know why that's moving without me pressing the button. And now it's out of balance, right? So you have vacancy, the red line, moving up. And then Boston is actually doing a little bit worse than the national average. These are going to come down into balance. The good news for the industrial market is vacancy or absorption or demand never actually went negative. It looks like it's bottomed out and is going to start recovering. Again, assuming we do the soft landing thing with the economy, we don't go into recession, we keep buying goods the way we have been. One thing that's interesting is I mentioned rent growth. So the people that leased space back here, let's call it a 10-year lease. They signed at lease rates here that are not anything like lease rates were here when the market got really tight. And even though the market is softer now, and there's a lot of availability, a lot of that availability really isn't competitive because a building, this is poor slide planning. So take a class to learn how to plan your slides properly. Buildings built back in the early part of this century are not really competitive with brand new construction in the industrial market. They're bigger, they're taller, you can get more inventory per square foot, which is part of the value. They're more suited for automation, they're greener. So a lot of this supply is relevant to people that leased back here. So when they lease, they're wanting to move, and that means higher rates. So that's helping the sector. So retail, we haven't actually built hardly any retail space in the last 5 years. And if you go back before 2014, the supply figures were even higher. And then we had, the great financial crisis. We had a structural change in demand for retail. We had the mall apocalypse, which is kind of still shaking out. But we didn't really overbuild. So vacancy, even though demand has been a little bit unstable, is kind of flat nationally. And in Boston, it's flat at a lower level. The retail market in Boston is very tight. And if you go to places like Allston, Brighton, and that kind of urban infill, retail is doing particularly well in Boston, as well as like the suburban grocery anchored, very traditional type stuff. What's starting to suffer now is the housing focused, the Home Depot, because there's not as much movement of people from one house to another, so that kind of stifles demand for that. But in general, the retail market's pretty strong now. Interestingly, the reason retail has this low vacancy, but it doesn't have that rent growth, is because it's not real estate fundamentals that drive rent so much as just the economy. If you have Five Below, or if you have the Dollar Tree or whomever, they can only pay rent enough to sort of keep themselves in business and follow their business model, and they're struggling because of that. So it kind of doesn't really matter if fundamentals are tight. The rents can only rise so quickly. Multifamily. I mentioned this is a supply story, so we had a similar situation with industrial. We had massive movement of people in the country driving vacancy way down, and then all of a sudden the supply starts catching up, and now we're getting to a point where we're oversupplied nationally. It does look like vacancy is peaking. The good news long term is like there are people, right? People need places to live. There are all sorts of really fascinating trends about household formation and more single-person households and people delaying marriage and having kids, and that really has implications for both the single and multifamily housing markets. I have a colleague who focuses on multifamily who can speak for a long time and yet still be interesting on those topics. I'm not an expert in that, but I think fundamentally the thing is the supply-demand imbalance looks like it's going to even out. The rise in interest rates actually stifled construction, which is probably a good thing for fundamentals in the market. And that sector looks to be self-correcting, again, assuming we have the soft landing scenario. So finally, let's get to my favorite, which is office. So this is what I live and breathe every day. Let's talk a little about demand drivers, which we've touched on already. It's the demand per worker, which is based on attendance, and then it's the number of workers, which is based on employment. We're going to look at how occupiers are behaving in this kind of shifting new normal era. And then there actually is a supply impact in the office sector as well. So first, let's look at leasing activity. So this is calculated as a percent difference from what was normal in 2015 to 2019, right? That's kind of how real estate people think of as normal these days. So this blue line is the number of leases that are executed in any given quarter. This is new leases. This is not renewing where we are. This is either opening a new office or moving from one to another. You can see the number of leases is as high as it's been in this decade-long period. Which you wouldn't necessarily, I would not have expected this a year and a half ago. But by this measure, the leasing market, the office leasing market is as active as it's ever been. But the average size of those leases is about 20%. Pending third quarter data, I think this is going to go down a little more, about 20% below that 2015 to 2019 average. So what that means is even though there's lots of activity, the volume hasn't recovered, and it hasn't been enough to account for move-outs, which we'll take a look at in a second. This is true most everywhere as well. So the blue is the number of leases. That's up in most places. It's still down in some of the Bay Area markets, Denver, Orange County. It's actually up a lot in Houston. And then, so the average size is down everywhere except Miami. I was down in Miami a couple weeks ago, and what they told me is that what's happened is the average lease size is coming down from what it was in the early 2020s, but it's coming down to what is normal for that market. So it's actually following the trend. It's just that it had a reverse trend before, and everywhere else was kind of flat. And now everywhere else is down, and Miami is back to normal. So leasing volume, the yellow dots here, is below its pre-pandemic norm everywhere except for Miami and Houston. I don't have Orlando and Tampa. They're also a little above normal as well. Now, lots of activity. A lot of that activity is concentrated in newer buildings. I was having lunch with some real estate people today, and we were just talking about, okay, well, if you could move anywhere as an office tenant, where would you go? And we said, okay, well, we'd go to One Congress. That's a nice building. Winthrop Center, the new South Station Tower when it finally delivers, 1001 Boylston, this nice building. And then we realized, wait a minute, these are all brand new buildings. Well, it's not just us that think that, it's also occupiers. Their demand is concentrating in new construction, but it's actually slowing down. So this is the amount of new construction that's on the market, right, that physically exists, whether it's leased or not. You can see it's peaked, it's coming down, it's gonna go way down really soon because construction starts are historically low right now. But the availability in that space is actually up. So the percentage of that space that's available is getting close to a quarter. So what's happening is that new construction is attracting the demand if it's in the right place. But if it's in the wrong place, like for example, downtown Denver, there's a building that delivered earlier this year that's like 92% empty because it's just not where people want to be for a variety of reasons. Commute, perceptions of safety, security, accessibility, amenitization, you can go on down the list. So the supply effect that we're starting to see is that the supply pipeline itself is dwindling, which you would think would help support occupancy everywhere else, and in a way it kind of is. But some of that supply is not ideally located, and that space is actually struggling to fill up, and tenants are starting to think, well, I'll just stay where I am and renew for another 5 to 7 years, and we'll see what happens when the next construction cycle begins. Maybe I'll find a better spot. So what does that look like in this supply and demand chart? So you can see supply has been pretty consistent for a decade, but it's about to fall off a cliff. I actually think that these next couple of quarters, some of that's going to get kicked out, maybe 60 to 180 days. But eventually, by the time we get to 2026, there's no new supply. This is a demand story, like I said at the beginning, right? Huge negative absorption, net move-outs, 3 periods of it, 2 in the past, 1 we think in the future, right after the pandemic. And then this is kind of, demand went negative again right around when Omicron hit after the vaccines came out. And it's the false dawn of the office market. And then recently this, basically flat demand on the net, no real net move-ins or move-outs. I think that's because those companies are standing pat. They're waiting for kind of the perfect opportunity, and also they're not hiring anybody. If you look at 0.5% growth rate and you extend that over the course of a 7-year lease, if you grow, let's say you have 1,000 workers at 0.5% per year for 7 years. In 7 years, you're gonna have 35 more workers. Are you gonna lease more space for 35 more workers? No, you're not. If you're growing at 5%, which is what some tech companies were growing at before the pandemic, then in 7 years, you have like 470 more workers. So that's a 40% increase. You're gonna need more space, right? And so they actually lease that space ahead of their needs, and now it's all on the sublease market, right? So the employment story, I think, is gonna really stifle demand, and it's gonna lead to this, because a lot of these move-outs are associated with lease expirations. A lot of times when leases expire, companies move into new buildings, but there aren't gonna be any new buildings for them to move into. So one theory is, well, they'll just keep the space. One theory is they'll move into another building, an existing building, and another theory is that, well, they're just gonna let it go, and they're gonna work with what they have. They're gonna sit tight and wait. That's the one that we think is gonna predominate. We'll see if that turns out to be the case. So I will, on this last one, the future of the office looks tactical. So if our forecast is accurate, then what that means is there's not necessarily a rising tide that's gonna lift the office sector in the same way that there is to varying degrees in all the other commercial sectors, right? Retail, industrial, multifamily. But that doesn't mean there's no opportunity. I think the tactical play is it, right? So the headquarters for the professional services firm that serves a secondary city. The office component of a mixed-use development in an Alston or Brighton. build to suit building for a big bank that's opening a new office in Dallas, Texas, which is already happening. I think those are the kinds of tactical plays that we're going to see succeed and do pretty well. There's no such thing as the average office building. But to win, I think it is going to be tactical. It's going to be a kind of a zero-sum game. If you win, it's because someone else probably lost. You stole their occupancy, you stole their lender or whomever. So, like I said, I will share those slides, so hopefully you can have them. Any questions about that, about any of that, or anything else? Yes.
You can talk about office spaces and how obviously there's a lot of vacancies and there's no employees coming to kind of fill those spaces. Is it possible for like a repurposing of office spaces? Do you think there'll be a transition in taking those office spaces, turning them into test spaces or living quarters above it?
Yeah, and it's happening. So there's a building on Devonshire, which is right down the street, like a block and a half from our CoStar office, that applied and received entry into the program that Boston's running for a tax abatement to convert. The buildings that work best for that are kind of mid-20th century, maybe 15 to 20 stories high, relatively narrow footprints. So a big 25,000, 30,000 square foot floor plate is really difficult to convert because you'd have to have really long, think bowling alley size shaped apartments. That doesn't work very well. And also the elevators are in the core, the restrooms are in the core, the plumbing's in the core. So you can do anything with enough money, but it's just not practical. So our analysis is that somewhere between 1% and 2% of office inventory is truly convertible. I think that's transformative within a radius of a few city blocks. On the other hand, that space isn't competing as office space anyway right now. So I don't think it moves the needle for office rents or even really occupancy. I don't even think, frankly, it helps a whole lot on the multifamily supply side. That building over in Devonshire is going to be like 80 apartments, which is great for 80 family units that move in there, but it's not necessarily going to change the overall environment.
Thank you.
Yep.
You alluded previously to there being old building and multifamilies, but then also in urban crisis. I was going to expand on that.
Yeah. Again, this is not my primary expertise, but I do follow it because I think part of whatever Renaissance office has, I think is going to be associated with urban multifamily development in places like Nashville and Raleigh and Charlotte and maybe Alston and Waltham and those kinds of places. The issue is really the ability for a developer to make money. So with interest rates going way up, it raises the cost of financing. With just kind of general, especially services inflation going up, it raises the cost of construction. Materials costs went up a lot 3 or 4 years ago. So the cost of building has gone up, which means that if you're a developer, you've got to have the price point at a certain level in terms of rent in order to justify building it, right? The thing is there's so much multifamily supply right now that even if you take all the government regulation and all the zoning, if you get rid of all that, right now the market is saying rents can only be here, and if you're a developer, you may need them to be here to justify building. And then you add in all those complicating factors with regulations and zoning and all of that, and it makes it really complicated. On the single family side, I'm an example, it's mortgage rate lock, right? Like I am not leaving my house and my 2.9% mortgage for, what was it last week, 6.2 or something? I'm not gonna double my mortgage rate to move because either I'm gonna be paying a lot more or more likely I'm gonna have to have a lot smaller house. So there's very limited supply of single family housing right now on the market that becomes available. And it's the same story for home builders, right? They've got to be able to Justify construction, actually newly built homes is the one segment that's been doing pretty well because they can play a little with price and financing and everything. But there's not a lot of people out there that can afford to plunk down, 80 grand on the typical, $400,000 starter home these days, and then pay a 6% mortgage rate on top of that. It's pretty difficult.
You see about how the New York City office sector is performing and like relative to other cities?
So New York is really interesting because it's basically 10% of the office stock in the country. So as it moves, so moves the country. For the most part, there are a couple markets like San Francisco being the poster child it's just been so bad that it's kind of dragged down the national stats as well. I think in some ways New York is a little ahead of the curve. The big Fortune 100 occupiers, when they adjust their footprints, it moves the market. And a lot of them pulled forward the adjustment. So, Google bought buildings and then moved people into those buildings and subleased a lot of extra ones, right? Facebook, Meta did the same thing. The banks, it depends on the bank and depends on the function, but the big investment banks, the big business-to-business banks that are headquartered in New York, they're using the office in a more traditional way than State Farm Insurance. So they've kind of made their adjustment. I think in many ways New York is a little bit ahead. I think their vacancy rate is, I believe it's 14% and the national one is 13.8, so it's tracking really closely. Yeah.
So let's speak about how you think the rent prices are going to change in different sectors.
Yeah. Apartment rents have been really flat. Depending on how you slice it, even negative in maybe the top segment of the market. We're projecting kind of slow growth there, roughly aligned with inflation. Retail, it's all about the consumer, right? So I think you could just about peg retail rent growth to GDP growth. It's almost that simple, and my retail counterpart might slap me if he heard me say that, but he has a more nuanced way of saying basically that. Industrial rents, it's really interesting because it is segmented in a way that the space that's truly in demand is still seeing rent growth, except in some really oversupplied markets. Meanwhile, and also along with that, there's a shortage of kind of small bay space, and in industrial, small bay is 100,000 square feet, 50,000 square feet. So rent growth there is pretty strong. If you get into, now who knows what's going to happen with the dock workers strike and how all that plays out, that's going to have some impact. But if you look at some of the southeastern ports that are starting to get oversupplied, they're going to have weaker rent growth for the sort of traditional warehouse and distribution stuff. Office, the thing with office rents, and we do forecast them to basically be flat starting next year for about a year. But as I've been telling people, they've been flat since 2020. As I've been telling people, if your rent is flat as a landlord and your costs have gone up 20% because of inflation, then are your rents really flat? They're not. And the other thing that's going on is remember I said tenants have preferred new space. That new space is really expensive to build out. And until about a year ago, tenants weren't really price sensitive. They were okay paying for that in the form of higher rents. They were just taking less space. So the sticker price has to be pretty high. But what landlords have been doing is say, okay, well, we'll cover X, somewhere between 80 and 100% of the build out. We'll give you extra months of free rent. So the lease concessions are up in office. So the effective rents are down even if the sticker price isn't. Yeah.
What role do you think amenities play in kind of drawing people back to the office?
This is such a difficult question to answer with data because amenities tend to all flock together, and tenants have not really had to make a choice between, say, transit orientation, a roof deck, and a marble lobby. Like you get it all, right? Because that's what new buildings have. And throw in LEED certification, throw in the fitness center, throw in, God forbid, the pickleball court. So what I hear from brokers about this, and this is, by the way, this has been true for at least 10 years, is that there's a lot of amenity space that doesn't in fact get used, but if you don't have it, you're unleasable. And that, on one level, sort of infuriates me. But on the other hand, I kind of understand it. I went and toured Winthrop Center a few months ago, and with a couple colleagues, and we came out and we were just like starry-eyed, like, this is amazing, that fitness center was great, and that bar was beautiful, and the roof, and then literally we half a block away, and the spell starts to wear off. And we're like, well, yeah, but I mean, I don't get here on the train until 8:45. I'm not going to use the fitness center, and that bar is really cool, and I'd probably go there twice in the first week and once in the next 2 months, and maybe never again after that. And it's Boston, and there's like 3 days a year that you can use the roof deck. So it's really complicated. Like, I think if you were a landlord who could somehow convince people, occupiers, that you're not really going to use this stuff, or, and this is one of those tactical opportunities, I think, is if you could build a pretty basic building that's in the middle of everything else that borrow other people's amenities, right? Oh, look, there's an Equinox in that building right there, and we're going to work a deal for our tenant so they can use it too. I think that would be an interesting approach. One of my kind of unsanctioned opinions is that culture is upstream of workplace experience and not downstream of it. The correlation is high, but like, which is the chicken and which is the egg, I'm not really sure. Yeah.
So where do you see the future for office? The more classy building with amenities, or the tenant will will it be more classy building, giving a lot of concessions to these new tenants that are coming into the market?
So I think it is, and I hate this word, bifurcated. I'll use fragmented or polarized, right? So even right now, we can see, like, I see national media stories about this, and they'll say things like, oh, Class A is good, Class B and C are bad. And that's just flat wrong. What's good is the very premium, like, trophy level, brand new space. It's doing well, but it's actually starting to do a little less well. And then your B minus, I call them carcass parking buildings, right? Like, it's just commodity space and it's cheap. And if you're a company that's gonna use the space, you're all gonna be there every day. And you don't really, you're not trying to attract the world's best software engineers, you just need a few claims adjusters. Like, there's a lot of that kind of space that's occupied, and it's performing perfectly well because it's cheap. It's not really in the middle, but between sort of the bottom 60% and the top 20% is this range that's really struggling because it can't compete from a sort of wow factor and amenities perspective with the trophy, but it's way too expensive to compete with the carcass parking buildings. And they've been bleeding occupancy for 5 years, and I think they will continue to do so. So that's like A minus B plus. Yeah.
Like, do you see the election
Nope.
impacting any of these trends, or federal policy following the election impacting this at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think the election will impact the federal workforce, which will impact the DC office market. I think various economic policies of either candidate, I think, are likely to be inflationary, which kind of has secondary and tertiary impacts on real estate. It could help keep interest rates higher. And then I think the third piece would be what is the federal governmental role in trying to do like the conversions, the repurposing of buildings. And I know the Biden administration has sort of curated a bunch of existing federal programs and tried to guide developers and municipalities in how to take advantage of them. I could see maybe some more of that happening. I think the government answer to that question really needs to be more localized. And frankly, I don't think municipalities are truly prepared to deal with it. I think, the Boston program is a good start, but it is only a start for what really is going to be necessary.
So Phil, tonight deciding you was sort of a big question that came to mind for me, at least ever so thinking in Miami. So it's one of my favorite things that we do is we take a group of students down to Miami this year.
Please tell me you go in February.
We do go in February.
Because I went in September and that was a huge mistake.
Yeah, I like the heat, but it's not for everybody. And so, the reason we go there is obvious, right? You look at the chart, you see growth, right? But we can just look at what's happening on the other side of Florida right now, and what's happening in Phoenix with day zero running out of water. And I spent a lot of my time thinking about all these ecological risks, right, that are demonstrably on the horizon. And so really my question is, and it's a prognostication and crystal ball question, is when did you see the market starting to price in these risks that sort of many of us sort of see as a semi coming down the freeway, but you don't see it the day right now?
Yeah. There's a couple of ways to answer this. I did ask people in Florida about this because I pointed out, I was like, I hear that climate risk is higher in coastal areas, warm weather areas, and then I look at the leasing stats and the strongest activity is in Miami and in Houston. It's like, what gives here? And some of them are honest enough to say, yeah, it's just not on the radar, despite the insurance cost, which I think it's the market's best current proxy for trying to address this stuff is the insurance market. I actually think it's having a greater impact on the residential side right now than the commercial one. So the other way I'll answer this is that we are working on creating some climate risk forecast scenarios. The thing about that is that the way those get baked into forecasting models is it's basically what is the impact on economic growth and employment. And it's really hard to hit the model hard enough with a climate risk that shows any appreciable difference versus, an economic depression. So I think, frankly, we're not satisfied with what those models are showing us so far, but it's on our radar. I think if you get outside the U.S., you hear a lot more about this, particularly from the investor side. So you get, European sovereign wealth funds, they care about this. I read a story a couple weeks ago. I don't want to slander because I don't remember which tech company it was, but it was one of the big tech companies, like one of the 5 names you'd know. And the story said that they have actually started quietly backing off their net zero pledge. And the reason is because they've invested so much in AI that they are using so much data center space that generates so much power that they just can't keep the commitment. And so that's an example of, to them right now, from where they're sitting, the economic benefit is kind of not worth it to them. So we'll see if that becomes a trend as well. That's a very uplifting answer to your big question, isn't it?
All right, so we will say a big thank you.